Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week.
We as a committee have decided that he should be appearing. He's been very receptive to appearing.
David Johnston has agreed to appear before MPs to face their questions about why he didn't call for a public inquiry into foreign interference. The opposition parties agree an inquiry is necessary, but they are divided over how far they should push to force one.
If Jagmeet Singh decides for once to do his job and work for Canadians instead of working for Justin Trudeau, then Parliament can force Trudeau to hold a full public inquiry.
We're going to look at other tools to continue to push for a public inquiry. We think that is so essential and so important right now.
So should the NDP pull their support for the Liberals over this? Can the opposition parties pressure the government to hold an inquiry? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Althia Raj, Andrew Coyne, and Kelly Cryderman is joining us tonight from Calgary, where I am as well, because we'll talk about the election coming up as well. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, we talked Tuesday about what David Johnston said. I'm wondering in the couple of days since then whether you've seen any indication that the government may have to change course, or whether the opposition parties feel they have a fighting chance in getting them to do that.
I don't think they feel like they have to change course at this point, particularly because the NDP looks like they're not going to hold their feet to the fire on this. Mr. Singh is taking a sort of a middle path, I think a relatively creative one, of saying, I'll go in and look at these documents that Mr. Poilievre refuses to look at, but I want assurances that if I do so, I'll have some sort of freedom to be able to speak my mind if I don't like what I see, if in fact they don't back up what Mr. Johnston has said. All that being said, we're still in this position where we're putting the onus on the opposition to disprove Mr. Johnston's report, his findings, rather than I think the onus which should be on the government. We're still in this process where, let's put it this way, if the government was actually interested in rebuilding trust, where we got a story here where they've been alleged to have benefited from interference by a foreign power to their benefit, I would think a government in that position would be going out of its way to show that this was a completely open and above board process. It would, at the very least, have got as a rapporteur somebody who had no connection to the Prime Minister or the government or the Liberal Party or the Trudeau Foundation at all. Instead, they did the opposite there. But more than that, they would be getting somebody who was absolutely acceptable to the opposition parties. When you're talking about something that is a breach of trust potentially between the parties, that seem to be absolutely above and beyond. They should be the one who have the onus on them rather than the opposition to play ball with the government.
Though it seems to me, Chantal, that David Johnston was actually saying the onus is on Parliament to do its job for parliamentarians. But I take Andrew's point that it's more up to the opposition parties to agree to that. But what do you think about how the government should rebuild trust given what has happened?
Well, before I go to the government, I'm going to go to Jagmeet Singh. I think he is taking a responsible path and looking for answers and giving himself or making sure he has the freedom to say, this is what I saw, not going into specifics, breaching national security code. Right. I also believe, despite the position of Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Blanchet, that it is totally possible to go look at this annex and these facts and to still believe that a public inquiry or an inquiry of some kind is necessary to rebuild trust. I'm skeptical about the notion that you will not want to know what you could know, but you will go in the House of Commons next week, if you're Pierre Poilievre or Yves-François Blanchet, and present the government with constructs of your own that are not based on the entire picture. I also believe that once you have taken into account all the facts and the big picture, a normal opposition party should still be able to find grounds to question the government's course of action.
Isn't that kind of the point, though, Althia, that if Pierre Poilievre, if he feels he goes to see the documents, that he feels in some way he won't be able to attack the government in the same way if he's actually seen what David Johnston's talking about?
So on Jagmeet Singh, I think, frankly, is like the only person that seems kind of statesman-like on this whole issue. The fact that you would have an opposition leader who chooses not to get sworn in, not to see the evidence or the supporting document that has fueled this whole discussion, because you cannot separate in your own head what is classified information versus what is not classified information, is ludicrous. Like, I think we talked about this on Tuesday, but You know, the Prime Minister is capable of doing this. The Minister of Public Safety is capable of doing this. Everybody who works at CSIS is capable of doing this. You should want to know what is at the source of this, and you can, yes. I mean, David Johnston is even asking you, please say publicly if you disagree with my findings. So it makes no sense. And to have, you know, the Bloc Québécois leader calling it a trap, Mr. Poilievre saying that he will not be silenced, this is just stupid. I don't know what else to say about it. And Jagmeet Singh, you know, it's a nice lob that Mr. Poilievre is trying to suggest to Mr. Singh to basically have an election over this issue. But do Canadians care more about free dental care, or do they care more about whether or not the government turned a blind eye to foreign interference? I think Mr. Singh is betting that more Canadians care about getting access to dental care.
Chantal, quickly, and then I'll get Kelly in. Yeah,
but do Canadians care that the opposition leaders who would present them with a rationale for having an election over this would have wanted to know all the facts that they could have known? The notion that Pierre Poilievre will not be able to attack the government if he goes and finds out what the big picture looks like is kind of saying, I don't want to know more because it allows me to say just about anything I want. I don't think that advances the debate in any way, shape, or form.
The only reason the opposition leaders are in that position is because Mr. Johnston has ruled out a public inquiry. If there was a public inquiry, the opposition leaders would not be having to answer these questions.
But that is where we are now.
No, because they wouldn't know anything in a public inquiry either.
Let's get Kelly in. Let's get Kelly in.
Jagmeet Singh might be taking the high road in this, but why does he have to? Why does he have to figure out that road? Why isn't there a path that is well laid out for opposition leaders to get this information? And he's having to have a back and forth with the Prime Minister's office on this. And again, I don't think it's up. I do think that if I was an opposition leader, I would be interested in this information, but we don't know what parameters will be put on learning this information. We don't know what the federal Liberals will throw back at the opposition leaders once they are led into this. And again, I think it comes back to the onus being on this government, and this also being a case of partisan political interference. And that is the problem with all of this.
Yeah, quickly, Althia.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to public inquiry. I've come and I believe that this is frankly the better way for the public, for Mr. Johnston, for the government. I would not be surprised if the Liberals actually try to get rid of Mr. Johnston as to have another person overseeing the public hearings in the fall. But I would just like to say that this whole discussion over the opposition leaders and whether or not they'll get sworn to secrecy has kind of taken away from some of the findings of facts that are actually in Mr. Johnston's report. I mean, there's actually real questions to be talking about that Mr. Johnston has uncovered, but we're not talking about them.
Andrew, 20 seconds, then Chantal.
Just to be critical of Mr. Poilievre, when a government is behaving as furtively and you know, not reaching out and not building public trust the way that this government is, that is the time it behooves an opposition leader to take the high road, to be the statesman. And the fact that he's turned what are legitimate concerns and questions into what look more, in his mouth, ugly and partisan, means he's basically giving the government a free ride.
Chantal.
I agree with Andrew on that point. I also agree with Althia that the government probably would like, and I believe Mr. Johnston should have, if he'd not been tone deaf to the political audience, said someone else needs to do the rest of this path, not me.
Welcome to another round of At Issue. Albertans getting ready to head to the polls this Monday in a tightly contested race.
This election is a choice between a united Conservative Party that's lowered taxes, balanced the budget, and returned Alberta to its place as the economic powerhouse of Canada. Or we can choose to go backward with the NDP and their recycled policies.
In this election, I urge you to vote to make sure the values we share, the sensible, stable, moderate values of Alberta's majority, are reflected in our government.
So what could be the outcome on Monday, and what impact could this election have on the rest of the country? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Althia, Andrew, and Kelly Cryderman, who's in Calgary, as am I. Kelly, you can start us off. This does appear to be an unusually tight race for this province, and I wonder what you think that might be due to.
It is, absolutely. But this is also, only the second election that we've had with a united Conservative Party, partially created by Jason Kenney. It's kind of, we haven't seen anything like this. We haven't seen, this is another rare election where the NDP is actually in contention when, that certainly didn't exist even 10 years ago. So there's a lot of precedent-setting things, and it's really interesting about how close it's been, and how the race has gone over this past month, of course, kind of muted by the wildfires and ups and downs with the parties. I think things were really set about a week ago when we heard the ethics commissioner's report and when the debate happened. And when I talked to conservatives this week, they're feeling some wind in their sails because of the debate, because Danielle Smith, who has been portrayed by the NDP, by her critics, as someone who says crazy things all the time, was steady and calm and performed reasonably in the debate, so she surpassed expectations. And there's this big concept with them about things being baked in or not, and whether the concern that they are hearing at the doors as they campaign in Calgary about Danielle Smith, about her leadership, whether those concerns are already baked into the decision-making process. And this week, it feels like everything is colliding, and you do feel that the NDP is trying hard to emphasize not only the ways that they differ from the UCP, but all the flaws with the UCP, including the past 4 tough years under Jason Kenney and now under Danielle Smith.
One of the things I think, though, for the rest of the country, Chantal, watching this election that's interesting is, depending on the outcome, how that might shift Ottawa's relationship with Alberta and the country's relationship with Alberta, depending on what kind of premier they get, one who really wants to be tough and independent versus one who might be a little more collaborative.
Looking at the federal-provincial makeup, I'd say that the first question is how isolated would Alberta be if the current government is reconducted versus whether if the NDP takes power. I don't sense that there is a lot of appetite in Ontario and Quebec to join Alberta in that kind of a fight, and certainly not in BC where the NDP is in power. So you're basically talking possibly more friction between Alberta and the rest of the country versus less. And I'm not saying that Rachel Notley would be an easy partner for any of the people that I'm talking about. But if I were Pierre Poilievre, I'm not sure that I would really wish for the election of a Conservative government next week, because he too will wear whatever Danielle Smith does, and that will not necessarily play well in Ontario.
Althia?
Yeah, it was interesting today. Pierre Poilievre decided to do an endorsement video for Danielle Smith, and while it repeated a lot of the UCP lines that we've heard in the past from Ms. Smith herself about how Rachel Notley would be listening to her bosses in Ottawa, Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. What is interesting to me is his decision, which is kind of late in the process. I mean, it polls, and this is the weekend where people are supposed to make their minds. It's interesting to me that he would come out. Stephen Harper had come out in April and endorsed Danielle Smith, but so many of the voters that Pierre Poilievre needs in Ontario are not going to look at this Danielle Smith endorsement and think like, this makes sense to me. And it also, I think, opens him up for not the first time, but on a big point of hypocrisy. He was very firm against Justin Trudeau and the SNC-Lavalin thing. And here is Danielle Smith, arguably, I would argue, doing something far worse. And he says nothing about it, not that you would expect him to, but he endorses her. So I don't think that this was very strategically a wise move. Andrew?
I would agree with that, and I think we have potentially trouble ahead of us as a country if Danielle Smith wins, and that's a big if. I mean, the most nervous people at this moment have to be the pollsters, because this is, I think, an insanely difficult election to model turnout, which will be absolutely determinative of who wins with such close polling numbers. But if she does win, I know that the Alberta Sovereignty Act was not front and center in this election campaign, but you can bet your boots she's going to claim it as a mandate and a validation and vindication of it. And there are fights ahead on, emissions caps and other issues on the federal-provincial file. And I would not put it at all past her to start invoking the act to try to wield it as a cudgel in those kinds of fights. She's got people around her advising her who are not on planet Earth, to be frank with you. And she has shown serially in the past that she's highly suggestible. She does not examine proposals that are put to her with nearly the kind of searching scrutiny she should. And so the combination of those two things is we could see some really quite radical proposals coming out of Edmonton, and I think we should all be bracing for it.
Kelly?
I just want to speak to Poilievre. I think, the fact that that endorsement is coming out today shows that the UCP is still worried. There are a lot of connections between Danielle Smith and Pierre Poilievre. They've known each other for 25 years. They both came from that Calgary school, and I think they do see eye to eye on a lot of issues like energy. And when we talk about the issues that are likely to be contentious, I think it's less going to be the Sovereignty Act, because a lot of people wonder how it's actually workable, and that is a major issue. Can you actually put it into place? What is going to be the big fight is over energy issues, over the cap that we're going to hear, the oil and gas emissions cap that we're going to hear more details on electricity, on Alberta withdrawing from the Canada pension plan. Some of these items that have flown under the radar, if the UCP is elected, are likely to become more contentious. But I don't think there's a lot of distance between Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith on a number of issues. Certainly, she could be a liability for him in some other parts of Canada, but they come from the same place.
Chantal?
Yes, and that would be a problem to Ontario voters. I watched Mr. Poilievre go through Quebec this week. Didn't have a stellar reception anywhere, including in ridings that he owns, in part his own fault. But if he's not going to do well in Quebec, he absolutely needs to convince Ontario voters that he is the Prime Minister that they want. And this is not an association that will make Ontario voters look up and say, this is our guy.
Okay, well, we'll all be watching with great interest on Monday. Thank you all very much for this. Appreciate it. That's our weekly rebroadcast of At Issue. Remember, you can catch The National on YouTube and, of course, CBC Gem. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you back here next week, if not before.